All right, let's transition now to behavior therapies. We've learned about those insight therapies, that talk therapy. Now let's look at behavior therapy. And behavior therapy is going to be based on operant and classical conditioning. If you think about it, a lot of the phobias or anxiety-provoking stimuli that we encounter have been conditioned into us. So, for instance, there was a video that mentioned if a parent is terrified of water, and so when you're young, they are constantly keeping you away from the water. You might go to the beach, but you can't go swimming. Well, after a while, you learn to become afraid of the water as well. So it becomes a conditioned response. Some of them might be unconditioned response. Mr. Woodard spoke about being afraid of snakes more than being afraid of ballpoint pens. That makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. So that becomes an unconditioned response for a lot of folks, that we respond to a snake with a bit of fear, and for some people, a lot of fear. So how do we combat that? We use operant and classical conditioning through behavioral therapy. So there are several different types of behavior therapies that we're going to talk about. Let's start with exposure therapy, which Mr. Woodard mentioned. His daughter is doing research on this right now. And that's when you expose the patient directly to the anxiety-provoking stimulus. So that person of this video, for instance, is a woman that lives with agoraphobia. She cannot ride an elevator. She's terrified. So what do? They put her on an elevator. Now, the exposure therapy is going to take, it's going to be up to the therapist as far as when you start to expose somebody to that anxiety-provoking stimulus. Exposure therapy is generally going to happen sooner than later. Systematic desensitization is a type of exposure therapy. It will just take a while. You really start thinking about the stair-stepping process towards the anxiety-provoking stimulus. So, for instance, this video that we'll watch here is a woman who has arachnophobia. They start her I think like 20 feet away from a little aquarium that has a tarantula in it. And over a period of days, they move her closer and closer until she can finally, I think she touches the tarantula. I don't think she will. So anyway, we'll watch that in class. But it's a stair-stepping process to exposing the patient to their anxiety-provoking stimulus. Aversion therapy, I think your book talks about this with alcohol. You pair a pleasant and an unpleasant stimulus to condition a repulsive reaction. So you've got, for instance, cigarette smoke. Well, smokers might like the smell of cigarettes. So if all of a sudden you start to associate the cigarette smoke smell that you like with a different chemical that a therapist might use in a conjunction with the cigarette smoke, that triggers that aversive reaction. A better example is what's in your book with alcohol. There's a chemical that therapists can actually put in an alcoholic drink. You ask the patient to drink the beverage. They end up getting very nauseous, and then they pair that feeling of nausea with the smell of the alcohol, and they'll stay away from the alcohol. Your great-great-grandfather was the originator of the aversion therapy. If you've ever heard of like the kid that steals grandpa's cigarettes and grandpa catches him, what does grandpa do? Grandpa takes the whole pack of cigarettes and makes the kid go behind the barn and smoke all of the cigarettes at one time, just one after another. Well, a little kid can't do that without throwing up. And so the grandpa has used aversion therapy in order to keep grandson from smoking the cigarette. All right, moving on here. All of those are using counter conditioning, just what I had mentioned earlier. There's we've used that conditioned response. We use that classical conditioning to condition a new response, whatever it is that is causing us anxiety. Okay? Operant conditioning therapies are going to use those punishments and rewards. So you can see here there's things like shaping. We did the shaping experiment in class with the nodding of the head. Using timeouts or contracts. Let's talk about token economies here. With token economies, you might see these in a mental hospital ward. So you want to change patient behavior. So you use a token. It's like money. And so now if the patient does a behavior that is something that you like and you want to continue that behavior, you give them a token, and then they can use those for more exercise time or different reinforcers. Maybe it is a cigarette, maybe it is food, whatever it might be. they can use those tokens. So you're using a reward in order to create new behaviors and new behavioral patterns, new habits. Participant modeling. Albert Bandura actually worked with people that did have a severe fear of snakes, and what he used was his behavioral learning concept, and he would take people that weren't afraid of snakes, or, and this is even stronger, take people that used to be afraid of snakes but can handle the snakes now, and take the patients that are currently afraid of snakes and watch another person handle a snake. And through behavioral modeling, they'll become more comfortable with handling the snake themselves, and eventually that anxiety will go away in dealing with their own fear, simply by watching somebody else. Again, this becomes very strong when you have people that have formerly lived with that anxiety-provoking stimuli themselves. Kind of goes back to what Mr. Woodard was talking about with some of those group therapies like Alcoholics Anonymous. You might have just a group of people that all have the same issue. Once you start seeing other people being able to successfully deal with that issue, you in turn follow along. I'll get through a few of the cognitive therapies here. Now you're going to start, and this again kind of goes with the insight therapy. In fact, more than kind of, it goes with the insight therapy, because you want to help people talk through their thinking and hopefully get them to think in different patterns. So you want them to think a little bit more rationally. And again, remember when in chapter 12 we spoke about this quite a bit. Most of these disorders, they realize they have an irrational thinking pattern. It's hard to break it, though, so you help them to break that pattern through cognitive therapy. Oftentimes, you'll see cognitive therapy used for depression and anxiety, and what you do in this is challenge that faulty thinking. You start to ask the patient, okay, I understand why you're thinking this way, but is that the way it's really going to turn out? Let's think about this more rationally. And so you get the person to step back and think a little bit more rationally about their irrational thoughts. You point out some of the irrational pieces of their thoughts. And this is a good little video here that is a therapist that kind of discusses how this works and how that person is doing it. Now, remember what Mr. Woodard said, though. You are not curing the person. You don't have the magic wand. You are simply guiding them through their thoughts to help them understand and recognize some of the irrational patterns. And there is a reinforcement piece here as well. They might know that their thoughts are irrational, but as somebody else is helping them and pointing out some of the irrational, or helping them to see some of the irrational aspects that they didn't even think about before, that kind of reinforces the fact, oh, okay, I was right. That is irrational. How can I think about this in different terms? And that's what cognitive therapy is all about. You also want to test and modify beliefs. That's how you can challenge the faulty thinking. If you are thinking in terms of, somebody that has perhaps obsessive compulsive disorder, and we saw the video with the woman that was holding the card and it caused her severe distress, and she even knew, she understood, I have this distress when I hold this card. Well, you might test that belief and say, okay, well, you've held that card now for 3 minutes. Is everything you touch now, is that contaminated? And you continue to work with that concept of contamination, and hopefully at some point they'll start to say, okay, it's not as contaminated as I expected. You saw that toward the end of that video where he takes the patient into her kitchen on that kitchen cabinet or the counter, and she has just touched the card. Then she has to put her hand on the counter. Then she has to use the counter as a normal normal countertop. Well, what have you done? You've changed the way that she's thought about the contamination. You've tested her beliefs about the contamination on that countertop. And if she prepares a bit of a meal and 3 people eat that meal and nobody gets sick and everybody's fine, you've just tested and modified her beliefs. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I'm just a little bit under 10 minutes. Mr. Woodard, it's all you.